Welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and on today's episode, we are diving into an adventure that Bill and a couple of guests that have been on this podcast before went on. We had Jason Ingram and Brian Emblem. They've been on the show before. And Brian actually came into the studio here to talk about this recent adventure the three of them went on. It's this amazing kind of swimming pool that these guys found that was just kind of sitting in the middle of an island. And what was interesting about it is obviously there's an island, you have a lake right there, you could go to the lake, but instead, the man who constructed it decided not just is he going to have this really cool feat of engineering to get different water into this pool, but just it was impressive about how he even built this thing in the first place. And the other really interesting thing about the story was the fact that this guy didn't actually even own the island and didn't own the property. So we're going to dive into all of that stuff on the way, but first, a word from today's sponsor, Casey's. This weekend, make your way to Casey's Restaurant in North Bay for an unforgettable get-together. Dive into our delicious appetizers and enjoy the best drafts in town. It's the perfect spot to unwind, catch up with friends, and savor great flavors. Don't miss out on the fun. Join us at Casey's for a weekend filled with good food, great drinks, and even better company. Today on the podcast, we have a special guest. He's making, I guess, his third appearance now on the show, and he came in person. So welcome again, Brian Emblem.
Thanks very much for having me.
And today, Bill, we are talking about a story you did back at the beginning of June. It feels like yesterday, but I guess I was looking at the date and it was like June 8th that this article came out. But you guys went on a bit of an adventure with you and another person who's been on the program before, Jason Ingram.
Yeah, no, this is going to be, who builds a concrete swimming pool? And Ben, we'll find out the difference between cement and concrete. Who builds a concrete swimming pool on an island in the middle of a lake, kind of somewhat remote lake, before swimming pools became popular? And the water source did not come from the lake, and being the island in the middle of the lake. So we're going to find all about that, and it's kind of like one of those epic Backroads stories about connecting all the dots. Because I think I first heard about this from Brian. He said, about this concrete swimming pool in this lake, Raven Lake, and let's go see it. And in fact, I know we talked about this for more than 2 years for sure, and perhaps even going back into COVID. Anyway, it goes on the list, and it was water access, so we had to do that. But just for the listeners, I'll put the geography into context. So Raven Lake is we're going east of KL City, Kirkland Lake. We're going east of Larder Lake and V-Town on Highway 66, and we're almost to the Ontario-Quebec border, and in the distance, we haven't talked about Mount Chamonix, but it's this bulbous rock. You turn and take the road down to Raven Lake, and the island is down the way, about somewhere between halfway and three quarters. Small island, mind you, like teeny tiny. When I say like this is not an expansive place, so that's the kind of the geography of the context, and then maybe we'll get into the discussion about this concrete swimming pool.
So Brian, where did you find the swimming pool? Because Bill just said that you were the one who kind of brought this up. So how did that come out?
My younger brother, Paul, he used to canoe the Larder Lake, Raven Lake chain all the way down to, let's say, the Englehart area quite often. He brought my attention to it. He used to do that in the 80s and the 90s, I guess. And it was just always in the back of my head that that's a thing that's there that's worth poking around and going checking out one time. So Bill and I made an effort with Jason from Larder Station and went for a trip.
Now, the interesting thing about this, that's about all that was known about this. So, as always, some cursory questions and no one has the answers. So the first thing was, okay, never mind that. We went, as you said, in early June, got there and went down. And it's an interesting lake, has some steep sides to it. And quite pretty, and at the end there's waterfalls because the Larder River is coming in, and then it tumbles down the Larder River chain, as Brian just explained. So we came to this teeny tiny island, and you're met with this kind of somewhat ornate railing and concrete steps going up to this flat part. Again, more for emphasizing the tiny island. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, here's a 16 by 32 to approximately 6 feet deep concrete swimming pool on this island in the middle of the lake, on this somewhat remote lake, and knowing nothing about it. So the first part, we surveyed the surroundings and did some measurements and took a lot of photos and looked around, because there was also a log cabin on the island, and you could see there was a patio kind of foundation to all this. And we knew one other bit of information that we had gleaned is that perhaps about this water source was somewhere else from a spring-fed lake, and we determined it could only be one lake. And so, Brian, why don't you pick it up and say what we did next once we surveyed the island?
So we launched the boat at the boat launch on the north end of the lake, and it's about a 3-kilometer drive down the lake to the island. And we poked around there a little bit, and we thought about, well, where would this water source come from? And we could hear in the distance on the east side of the lake from the island, you could hear water running, like a small creek or a small waterfall. So we thought, well, that has to be the source of this water for this pool. And then we went across and poked around, and then Jason came across. I mean, it was almost impossible to see. You're looking for a brown 2-inch pipe, or a rusty old brown 2-inch pipe, or a plastic pipe in a mat of wooded roots. And lo and behold, he found it. It was quite a bit of an ingenious little system to get the water from this elevated point on the far side of the land to the pool, so it wouldn't become a stagnant, mosquito-infested cesspool. It became, it turned over without a pump, right? It was pretty ingenious.
Very ingenious, because it was gravity fed. It had to go, again, down the slope underneath the water. It was more than, about 200 meters across, at least, to the shoreline, and then up the pool. And when we did the examination of the pool, you could see where the pipes came in and came out. Now, we didn't describe the concrete swimming pool very well, is that, of course, now there are these mature trees growing all around the pool, in the middle. And you could see some rusted junk in there, a bed mattress frame in particular. So that was another thing. So we enjoyed the day. We went down to look at there were early dams going back to approximately 1910, concrete abutments and those kinds of things, and the remains of a fish ladder and things like that. So that was very interesting as well. So that's one part of the story. But before we leave that story, I know, Ben, you've been wanting to know the difference between concrete and cement, because that's going to lead into where I'm taking us about the person who actually made that swimming pool. Brian, you should explain that. Being a retired mechanical engineer, you know all about concrete and cement.
Yeah, so it's a common misused term. So cement is an ingredient in concrete. Concrete is the hard thing that you see on the side of the curb or your basement of your house. Cement going along with gravel or sand or an aggregate of some kind with water, that's the ingredient. So it's like flour in a cake. Cake is your final product. Flour is an ingredient. So cement is an ingredient in concrete. So it's a common misnomer. But anyway.
Yeah, because people usually mix those two up, right?
Absolutely.
Like they use them interchangeably.
Happens all the time.
So because you would never use cement on its own.
It drives my business
So we're all
partner
learning
crazy
here today, that's for sure. And so the burning question became, who would mix this concrete to make this pool? Because the walls were approximately 7 inches thick and in good shape. The pool is in good shape. You could you could see where there was old paint flecks of old kind of that bluish aqua colored paint left over. So the neat part of this story is the power of social media, because none of this is written down. And we have a couple contacts. They didn't know very little about it. So I think upon Brian's suggestion, I posted in the McGarry Township and the Larder Lake Facebook groups and explained exactly Backroads Bill's doing a story. Do you know anything about the swimming pool on Raven Lake? And it was almost immediate that stories came about from people in the area. And of course, this is all in part you don't know what's the difference between fact and fiction, because people are relying on their memories of the memories of others in an oral tradition. And it started out being that it was a rich American who had a wife who had a disability, who made this, circa World War II for her. And there was some information about, as Brian explained, about the piping system. So that became apparent that this was done, and of course we found it. So it was a real fact. So we're, given the term of the day, fact checking, that's what you start to do. So all these innuendos and rumors and things, and people keep building up and up, and so then all of a sudden there was a couple of people who really seemed to know, and all of a sudden the person had a name, Joe. And people could remember swimming in Joe's pool, and they could remember him mixing all the concrete by hand. And which, again, Brian calculated the volume of that pool being approximately what? It's in the story, which Ben will link at the end. I think
it says, I'm just looking at the story now.
Was it 2,000 cubic meters?
It said 20 cubic meters of hand mixed cement would have been needed. But I don't think it says how many. Oh, here we go. 68,000 liters?
Yeah, approximately water needed. So Joe, we didn't know anything about Joe. And so then all of a sudden, a couple of grandchildren piped in. Actually, before that, I got a call from someone who said, "Hey, what are you posting about my fishing hole island?" And he was
fishing in the swimming pool?
Well, no, it was his favorite camping spot, and I was letting people know about it, and he was just tongue in cheek. But then he knew lots about it, and he knew that his mother had photos in a family album. Lo and behold, it was the first time that there was some evidence about the concrete swimming pool. So I waited for those, and they were, back in the film days, from the photo album. And of course, he took a JPEG of them, and so they're a little grainy, but you could see the concrete swimming pool. So people started talking about stopping at the island, and finally the grandchildren contacted and said, "This is my grandfather," and it was Joe Suovich, of Russian origin, who worked in KL City as I think a tax collector, tax assessor. He had a wife, but she wasn't disabled, and made the pool for her. And it was probably in the late 1940s, circa 1948. How long it took him to complete it, no one seems to know. And yes, he piped the water from, because we, again, found the pipe. So we knew about that, and he stayed on that island for a long, long time. But Brian, before I go to the next part of the story, just some of your impressions of what we found there that day, and just, some of the unique things we've seen over the time. But from a humankind perspective, this was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I had never been there, obviously, and so when you get off the boat and you walk up, concrete's kind of permanent, so that it's still there. The set of stairs where the dock used to be, I guess, or the pier, and you walk up and then you turn like, wow, look at that! It's a semi-in-ground pool, and my mind starts to go directly to, wow, this would be Wonder if you could refurbish this and make this a pool again. My grandkids would love playing here.
Yeah, we didn't bring the deck chairs just yet.
No, not yet. But you can sort of put your mind and then about where the cabin was. You can sort of visualize how that was. But then when you have the photos, it puts it all together quite nicely. But getting back to the social media aspect, and there, I before going there, I started asking people that might have known or people who had some knowledge of history in the area, and the rumor mills, they were rampant.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite rumor mill ones was it was a place for the Kirkland Lake ladies of the night would go there and convalesce back in the old days, or that the owner had a Russian mail order bride that he she demanded a pool. Anyway, these crazy I don't know what you call them, wives' tales or rumors or
well, it's funny how much it changes, right? Because what you heard from people just on social media, just talking about like, oh, she was like disabled and she needed a swimming pool, and then they're like, that's not what happened.
No,
it's really
so you have to
interesting.
keep asking these questions because, again, my avocation, but you want to get to the truth. And this is kind of important because we later found out that Joe did not own the island.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
He
like,
didn't own the island. He was a squatter, and that's the term that was used. And he was there from about 1948. His wife eventually died, but he actually got together with the person that was caring for his wife. This all came out on Facebook. This is not. They're just sharing all these posts of people. So this rumor like talk and all this is people are just telling the truth of what they kind of remember or what they know. And so Joe was there, but in the between, you see, we had this reference that the island was owned, and Phil Davis, who lives down the way close to Larder Lake, King Kirkland, and there was this reference that of a last name Mills that could have been on the island. So that became part of the questioning, and lo and behold, it comes right out that there were 2 mills with family names and people that lived in the area. And then there's the lake that where the water came from was named from somebody probably in the States, and someone had taken the family on a tour of the lake, like recently, whatever that means, in the last few years. So we didn't that connection has never been solved. But the thing about Joe, and then Phil Davis went back and looked at some land tenure maps. And lo and behold, there's a land use permit on the island, but it doesn't belong to Joe, and you'd have to do an extensive search to find out. So that's still one of the things that's mysterious about the concrete swimming pool on Raven Lake. But Joe did not own the land. He had the cabin, and this is important because Jason Ingram went back, I think the day after, because we didn't bring a spade along. He went back and dug down, and of course he started hitting all this refuse, this metal and things. And so what we found out from this Facebook post too is that the Ministry of Natural Resources at the time, and this was a standard practice, went down and they probably emptied the cabin, threw it all in the swimming pool, and then burned the cabin and returned it to a Crown Land status, so to speak, except for the swimming pool, which now looks like this gigantic terrarium with all these mature trees sticking out of it. So it is kind of unusual. So we found about that too. And again, about the approximate range when he was there. And since then, it is part of that Lauder River canoe route on the edge of it. So it is a camping spot, but not a designated one. So that's a lot of all those Facebook posts. Everything we're telling you about probably came from there. And then you're just like a jigsaw puzzle. You're putting it all together to come up with what our solving that initial question, who does this?
I kind of find it funny how this guy he just comes up, finds an island, takes it over, builds a cabin, builds a swimming pool. And I'm sure like that's probably not like a normal thing to do, like especially considering you're right by the lake, right?
Well, the whole thing, bringing water from another source, that you don't want the water from the lake, and of course that's the ultimate husband, I guess, so on the honey-do list. So that, but then again, before swimming pools in North America, they're few and far between. The backyard swimming pool didn't really become popular probably to the 1960s, 70s. And in Northern Ontario, if you saw a swimming pool in someone's backyard, not compared to today when you have in-ground and self-supporting swimming pools and those kinds of things, you don't even think. But back then, a swimming pool, and then on the island, again, it was just doubly intriguing.
Brian, I'm interested, as somebody with your background, how well constructed was this swimming pool?
Well, it's lasted a long time. It's still there. Imagine.
Because I'm assuming this guy was not probably an engineer, or, he's just kind of...
Well, in one post, he did it all by hand. And eventually someone said he had help from brothers. But we can't imagine, although you can't see the breaks. They must have been a really good job with the parging effect or the troweling effect on the sides of the pool. I don't know. They would have had to build forms, Brian, for that, and they couldn't. There's no way they did it in one pour.
Well, and they would have had to excavate it too, right? And
well, that's the other thing. When you look at the island, it's built into it's
kind of a natural gully there. It would have been on bedrock. I mean, yeah, sir, some
They worked with what they
surface
had.
layer would have
Yeah.
had to come off.
So I was
but
going to say that'd be really impressive because I know, like, obviously where we are kind of in the Canadian Shield, it's not easy to just find a plot of land and dig it out, especially back then when you probably didn't have access to the same equipment that you do now.
Well, in our travels and things on the Backroads, you come across the remains of head frames, mining head frames. Some are still standing, and logging camps and radar bases and things that go back. And then this one here is approximately 75 years, and it very quickly nature takes over. I explained the trees inside the walls of the swimming pool, but when I think about it, it's probably one of the most unusual humankind things. I mean, logging camps, mining camps, those kinds of things, but not a swimming pool.
Yeah, and again, take like what we said, it's like it's on the lake, but you take it from a different water source because you don't want the lake water.
it's gravity. It's like free gravity, free pumping of water from from another spot.
And it's kind of amazing when you think about people who are able to like engineer this kind of stuff too, because
it's ingenious.
It is ingenious, absolutely.
So your question was, what was his wherewithal? I mean, people were, like even today, are pretty handy, so to speak, but that was a project in itself. And again, you had to transport all the materials across the lake. If said he had a little tin boat, and of course, from the closest place would have been probably where he brought the bags of premix, I guess, or back. And he would have had one of those. He had to have one of those cement mixers, concrete mixers, right, with the barrels that turn around and shovel the sand in. He would have had to brought sand over and things like that, because we thought, well, maybe all it was brought over in the wintertime. We don't know, but probably not. He had a daytime job and he lived in the area in Kirkland Lake. So yeah, it's kind of a neat project when you think about your backyard projects.
I always laugh because I think back to the person who actually owned that land, and imagine just going there and being like, why is there a swimming pool and a cabin here?
Well, it would be Crown land squatting, I guess, right? It would have been no real
in the
ownership
beginning,
at the time.
But if somebody owned the land, right, can the Crown take it back?
No. Well, only if they can expropriate. But in this case, we don't know. A land use permit is where you kind of rent the land, and there is the reference, and then it disappears. So how it was taken off, maybe in the formation of the Larder River Provincial Park, it was taken off, and maybe that was one of the reasons after Joe had passed on that everyone knew he was squatting. So the Crown, again, it was a normal course of practice, because back in the day, people just went out and built cabins on the land and did that sort of thing. But anyway, we don't know about the land tenure now that it seems to be back to the Crown, and this Adamson family name that is onto the lake where the water kind of came out of, we don't know about them. So there's still a couple of questions, but we solved most of the part about the concrete swimming pool on an island in the middle of a kind of a remote lake, and the water does not come from the lake for the swimming pool.
And it wasn't a place for ladies of the night to convalesce.
Maybe.
Exactly.
Well, it's so nice to have the family members pipe up,
That's true.
and clear the mud
To
there.
dispel that rumor.
How did you guys get there? Did you take a canoe? Take a boat?
We had a boat.
You had a boat, okay. I only bring that up because today that we're recording this, Bill, it is
National Canoe Day, and
Yep.
Brian and I were at the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough, the new one, and so that particular day, Jason canoed back, and there's been all kinds of stories involving canoes because it's certainly a big part of my life. But it is National Canoe Day, and we're talking about something water related, and it's and so happy National Canoe Day to you, Ben, because you were recently in the North Bay to Mattawa canoe race for your very first time with Michaela.
Yeah, I
and that
entered it.
went went wonderfully well, and you'll go again, I hope. And it's an important day in Canadian culture.
So for the people who want to get there by canoe, how would you suggest the best route is, or by boat? What do you think the best route is to get to this place?
For easy access, as Brian explained, it's approximately 3 kilometers down the lake from the landing, a good landing. So you could get a small boat or canoe, and if you're going to take the canoe route all the way down, it's highly recommended because of the rapids and the history on that river, and I think it's one of those not so well known canoe routes in Northern Ontario.
So what's next for you guys? What's the next story that you, Brian, you got anything?
Lots.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, just yesterday we stumbled across post-Depression day airport construction in the north, some of which are still being used and some of which are overgrown. But that was an excellent day yesterday.
Yeah. So back in the day, Ben, in the late 1920s, 30s, there was a string of airports all the way across Canada, but all the way across northern Ontario, and they had to be. I don't want to get the distance wrong, but they were, as Brian said, in the depression, there were relief camps, construction camps, and they built highways and they bought these airports, built these airports, which were the precursor to airmail, where the first they would take these small planes to these small airports, would hopscotch across the landscape with the mail. So that's a story. And then, of course, most recently we did the Mica Bay incident, and Brian and I discovered the mine, one of the contentious mines on that day. And then most recently we'll talk about the two largest mega projects probably in northern Ontario, the Ogoki Reservoir and Long Lake, which turned rivers that were supposed to flow north to James Bay, and they made them turn around and go the other way into Lake Superior, and not really anyone knows about it. These would never happen again. The reservoirs themselves, each one twice the size of Prince Edward Island, and actually found out too that there was going to be a sixth Great Lake north of Lake Nipigon in the northwest, and no one thought anything about just go ahead and do these kinds of things. So lots of adventures, and too many to list, but stay tuned.
Yeah, let's ever just one thing. Thank you, Brian, for joining us. I'm sure you'll be back on after when you deal with the amount of adventures you guys have been on. I'm looking forward to hearing some of them. But yes, thank you so much for taking the time and coming into the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, always a pleasure to have Brian in. This is obviously his third time that he's been in now, so a big thank you for him for joining them. Actually, Brian and Bill were just coming back from the launch of the Canoe Museum, and we are trying to get some people on to talk about that, but they actually were on their way up, which is why Brian, who's usually in Timmins, was able to join us in studio. So that was a real treat to be able to meet him physically in person for the first time, but also get his kind of thought process as a professional engineer. It's kind of cool to hear his take on how, these guys were able to build this thing and they didn't really have the tools that were available, or they had to get kind of creative with how they did stuff. And it's always really interesting to see the stuff that was built many, 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 many years ago that gets just built properly. Well, if you enjoyed this episode of the Backroads Build podcast, you can hear more episodes on your favorite podcast player. Of course, the video version, as always, is available on the North Bay Echo YouTube channel, and all episodes are available on NorthBayEcho.ca, with new episodes dropping every Wednesday morning. And you won't want to miss next week, as Bill and I chatted with a lady who cycled with a trike from one side of Antarctica all the way to the South Pole. It was about 600 kilometers, took something around 10 days. It was in very grueling conditions. She actually has the Guinness World Record for the first person to do this, and it was faster than some of the people who've done it on skis. She's had a lot of really cool feats, and so it's really going to be a fun one to listen to. We had the pleasure, of course, chatting with Maria Leierstam. So make sure to subscribe and follow so you get notified the second that podcast becomes available on whatever platform you want to listen to it on. So that about does it for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the Echo Essentials newsletter on our website, NorthBayEcho.ca, and we will see you next week for a trip to the South Pole.